Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
General Jackson was kind enough to write to me afterwards, and he said, but for your presence, things could have been quite different. That's enough, more than enough for me. And I regard it as one of the highlights of my time in uniform.
This is Cold War Conversations.
Thanks to financial supporter Phil Hennessy for providing today's introduction. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. In this gripping episode, we hear a detailed account from an eyewitness right at the heart of the tense NATO and Russian confrontation in Kosovo in 1999 at Pristina Airport. NATO General Wesley Clark had ordered the British to use force to remove Russian forces. However, British General Mike Jackson refused with the immortal words, "Sir, I'm not going to start World War III for you." I'm speaking with former BRIXMIS officer Stephen Harrison, who was British Army liaison officer to the Russians and was the translator at the complex and fraught negotiations at the airport. I'm delighted to welcome Stephen Harrison to our Cold War conversation.
The initial tensions came to the fore and came to the knowledge of the international community in March of '98 when there were ethnic tensions in Kosovo, which had been brought about by the killing of 30 Albanians at Drenica. That really alerted the international community to ethnic tensions going on. And in September of '98, 250,000 Kosovar Albanians were expelled from Kosovo, and there soon then developed a humanitarian crisis just before the onset of winter. 50,000 Kosovar Albanians living in the open. In October of '98, agreement was reached at NATO level for airstrikes to be threatened. And that was followed in January of '99 when there was a further massacre of Kosovar Albanians in Račak. And that culminated in end of January of '99 when the United Nations Secretary General authorized the start of an air campaign to relieve the humanitarian crisis. The talks took place in Rambui, and the Serbs pulled out of those talks. They re-engaged with the talks later on in March, but they refused to accept any NATO-led implementation force to come in and assist with the humanitarian effort. And that coincided with a build-up of Serbian forces in Kosovo. And they then started the deployment of NATO troops into Macedonia. And by the 10th of March in '99, there were 4,500 UK troops in Macedonia as part of a NATO contingent. Talks were still underway at a high level between the Serbian leader Milosevic and US envoy Richard Holbrooke, who was doing a sort of a Kissinger commuting mission, pleading with Milosevic to allow humanitarian aid to come in, and the stick that he was wielding was the threat of airstrikes. That was dismissed by Milosevic, and on the 23rd of March 1999 the air campaign started, and it went on right up into June. So March until June of 1999 the air campaign was waged by NATO.
And Stephen, that air campaign, that's the bombing of targets in Belgrade as well and all over
Indeed,
Serbia.
Yeah. Holbrooke persuaded the Russians not to play ball with Milosevic, which was a huge, significant step for us, that we knew that the Russians weren't going to support Milosevic in this. At least that was our thought at the time. Of course, events as they transpired, the Russians did interfere significantly, which culminated in the deployment of both aircraft and troops. On the 12th of June, the Russians moved a convoy from Belgrade, I believe. I'm not quite sure of their origin, but they moved a convoy of BTRs, 2 companies' strength, and they took the airport in Pristina. But in between, while all this was going on, the Russians were very keen to know what was going on, what NATO was doing in Macedonia in their preparations for conflict. And the vehicle that they used to get into Macedonia to see what we were doing was the Vienna document 99, which was an agreement on confidence, security and building measures to allow participating and signatory nations to visit other countries where there had been a build-up of forces or where they thought troop deployments were, in order to satisfy themselves that there was no intent to cross any borders or to create unrest. So in May of 1999, the Russians sent out a notification that they wished to carry out a specified area inspection. That's the official terminology, a specified area inspection inside Macedonia, centered around Skopje, a vast tract of land. And there were arrangements in place under the Vienna document for countries to host such specified area inspections. They had no choice but to accept these inspections. And so I was at that stage working in the UK's arms control organisation called JSIG, the Joint Arms Control Implementation Group, where I was a team leader for teams both carrying out inspections and hosting inspections by other nations. UK was appointed the lead nation to deal with the Russians, and so I was sent out with a team to the shoe factory in Skopje in Macedonia to prepare for the arrival of a Russian inspection team led at 1-star level and comprising a team of 8 inspectors from the rank of 1-star down to lieutenant colonel. The Russians issued us with a map of the area which they wished to inspect, and under the terms of the Vienna document 99, it was the host nation's responsibility to facilitate Russian access to all the areas. Now, the Russians were coming into Macedonia, so what NATO did straight away was say, okay, in that case, Macedonia are the hosts of this inspection, which really threw the Russians because they had expected to be hosted by NATO. But the host country was Macedonia. And so when the Russians arrived and demanded access to helicopters to overfly the specified areas, the hosts, the Macedonians, said, I'm sorry, we don't have any. The Russians were genuinely shocked and surprised at the reception that we gave them when they arrived. They expected us to facilitate their every wish to go to areas where not only British but also American, German and French troops were assembling and were preparing for war. When I went over to Macedonia, the first thing that happened was I was briefed by the Chief of Staff there, Chief of Staff of the ARC, the Ace Rapid Reaction Corps, a 2-star, who said that this specified area, the Russians were not going to be allowed to go anywhere where there were legitimate operational and security concerns. So that was the starting point. You can take the Russians anywhere except where we have troops. So I, as an arms control person, said that was not in the spirit of Vienna Document 99, and that it was our obligation under the agreement to host these. But the line that came back not only from the Chief of Staff and COMK4 and MOD and the United Kingdom delegation in Vienna was they can go anywhere they want as long as our operational and security concerns are observed. So what that meant was the Russians arrived expecting to be allowed access to all the troop deployments, and we were in no doubt whatsoever that were they to be given access to these areas, that the first thing they would be doing is relaying that back to the Serbs. So they arrived, and I met them as the senior escorting officer, and we took them to the Hotel Continental in Macedonia, where we were to give them their initial briefing on what was planned. And it was the deputy commander of K4, General Andrew Ridgway, who gave the briefing. And he started talking about the humanitarian crisis in Macedonia and where there were pinch points for this and where the reception centers were and how the International Red Cross was helping. And he produced a map showing all of the reception centers. And the Russian general said, "Stop! No, we're not interested in the humanitarian crisis. We want to go and have a look at the troop locations." Well, that was flatly denied. That we said that we would give them access to everywhere where there were no legitimate operational and security concerns.
Stephen, I just wanted to ask you a question there. So under this Vienna document, you couldn't declare a PRA, a permanently restricted area, like you were able to with the Soviet military liaison missions that were in West Germany during the Cold War.
You could declare sensitive points. But the subtext was that in the interests of transparency and openness, sensitive points were to be kept to an absolute minimum. Well, in the case of this inspection, everywhere was declared a sensitive point. So when the inspection started and we got into our vehicles, the Russians said, right, first thing we want to go and do is go and have a look at the airport, which is where the American air contingent was based. And my brief was to take them to the perimeter road of the airport, stop the convoy, go to the general and saying, "I am now declaring a sensitive point." And he laughed when I said this. He said, "How can you declare a sensitive point? This is an international airport." And I said, "This is a sensitive point and you're not allowed access." Well, he was furious and he disappeared and he rang whoever he rang and lodged then a formal protest. He then said he wished to go and visit areas where the Russians clearly knew there were troop formations. And as soon as we got to the immediate vicinity of all of these areas, I would stop the convoy as the senior escorting officer, go out and speak to the Russian general and say, "I'm sorry, we declare a sensitive point." At that point, the Russians clearly twigged as to what was going on, and they were going to get no access to anything of interest. We offered them access to the refugee processing centers and to have a look at what magnificent efforts NATO was making on the humanitarian front. But that was clearly not the reasons why the Russians had come to Macedonia. So they cut the inspection short, lodged a formal protest with General Jackson and Generals Ridgway, and said that the UK as lead nation had been in breach of the Vienna Document 99 and that there would be significant and severe repercussions in Vienna when they lodged their report. And I've got the text here of the interim signal that the Chief of Staff K4 sent back to Vienna that night. And he said, "The formal part of the Russian inspection has now concluded. I had a reasonably amicable 1-hour meeting with the Russian team leader. He was clearly frustrated, and he claimed not to understand why we had failed to be as open as he would have wished and as the Vienna document requires. I explained that we had complied scrupulously with all the terms of the document, and the inspection team had been given a comprehensive briefing and had been able to observe all the training that was taking place during the period of the inspection, other than those areas where we had legitimate security and operational concerns. They had even been given the opportunity to observe current operations in the refugee camps. The inspection period was cut short, as it had not provided the opportunity to inspect military installations, and this was clearly a major disappointment for the Russians. The Russian general was reluctant to accept that the ongoing conflict between NATO and FRY imposed limitations on any freedom of action. I suspect the final report will be critical of NATO for encouraging the troop contributing nations to be less forthcoming than normal, and of the Macedonian government, who were, after all, the official hosts, for allowing this to happen. In summary, there will be adverse comments at Vienna as a result of this inspection, but I believe that we were as open and compliant as possible within the constraints imposed by our legitimate security and force protection needs. So that was the atmosphere under which this Vienna document specified area inspection took place. The Macedonian host, when he was greeting the Russians, let slip that the current force levels in Macedonia were 16,500. Now that figure is significant because, again, under the Vienna document, any force concentration out of normal barracks in excess of 13,000 automatically triggers what's called an observation, which is a means by which a nation can go into a country to ascertain the reason why there's been such a big build-up. So the result was, when the Russians got back, that an immediate request for a Vienna document observation was lodged. The result of that was that the United Kingdom was again deemed to be the lead nation for this, and I was then told to stay in Macedonia. I had expected to be in Macedonia only for the 4 days required for the Vienna document inspection, and I had made arrangements at home to be away just for 4 days. I'd given my dog, my Springer Spaniel, to my next door neighbours on the Monday, and I said I'll be back on the Friday. That was on the 3rd of May. I returned home on the 29th of July. So this 3-day stay in Macedonia turned into a much longer stay. Anyway,
this must have been really interesting for you, because it's almost like the boot is on the other foot compared to your BRIXMIS role. You're trying to prevent the Russians from seeing stuff, and when you were with BRIXMIS, you were trying to see stuff that the Russians didn't want you to see.
Yeah. Yes, you're absolutely right. And of course, when I was conducting inspections myself inside Russia, both under the terms of the CFE, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, and the Vienna document, I would do my utmost to get round the obstacles the Russians put in my place to visit barracks and training areas and troop concentrations. But I was poacher turned gamekeeper, I suppose. BRIXMIS was a unit that trained many people in Russian equipment, Russian language, and observation skills and photographic skills. And therefore, JSIG, the arms control people, they naturally drew upon ex-BRIXMIS people, because by now, of course, the wall had come down. And so many BRIXMIS people found themselves working in the arms control arena, using their language and their equipment skills and their diplomatic skills, or perhaps their communication skills would be better. But yes, I did find myself in the unusual position, and I had a degree of sympathy with the Russians as well, because we had conducted a similar inspection on the Russians themselves when they were very reluctant to come in. I went down in 2001 to Chechnya and I was the only UK representative in a 4-man team, American, French, German, and a Brit, when we insisted on access to Grozny in Chechnya to go and have a look at the troop concentrations down there. And they were understandably reluctant to allow us in, not only to prevent us from gathering information and intelligence, but also they had legitimate force protection concerns on our behalf. But we insisted on it. So I had some sympathy with the Russians. They were carrying out an inspection under the terms of the Vienna document, which allowed them to be there and which required the host nation, Macedonian, to facilitate that visit as a confidence and security building measure. And there we were, with the Brits leading this effort, turning around and saying, no, you can't even go into an international airport because we're declaring this to be a sensitive point. You can't go down this road. We're declaring it a sensitive point. But you can go and see a refugee camp. And they were understandably very, very frustrated.
And I imagine the Russians had quite a big file on you at this point as well. So they knew who they were up against.
Interesting you should say that, because, surprise, surprise, 3 of their inspection team were people I had worked with and against when I was in BRIXMIS. So they had used the same people who were known intelligence operatives to be members of teams that went to carry out these inspections, as we did. So it was meeting old friends again, but under different circumstances. At this time, I was preventing them from getting access to NATO troops, and they were doing their level best to find ways round it. But we wouldn't provide them with helicopters. We wouldn't provide them with anything. And we kept reminding them that this is not our country. This belongs to Macedonia. And if you have a problem with this Vienna document inspection, then complain about the Macedonians, because it's nothing to do with us. But you can imagine the furore that erupted as a result of this, and there were all sorts of protests lodged, not just by the Russians, I have to say. And I've got a copy of a signal here, in which the Italians complained vigorously that the Vienna document inspection had not been hosted in a proper way, and that it was likely to lead to a further escalation of tension and degrees of sympathy on the Russian side with the Serbs. And so this was the atmosphere under which the Vienna document inspection was conducted and concluded. And then I was tasked to stay on to prepare for and host the inevitable, what was called Russian observation, which was going to be a far more intrusive affair where we would have no right to stop overflight. So I remained as a JSIG, an arms control officer, embedded within the headquarters KFOR, and it was a bit like being a bad smell. I was not welcome there at all. In fact, I remember General Jackson, and you're probably going to have to bleep this out, Ian, but we were in the morning briefing and he came up to me and he saw my badge on my arm and he said, "What the fuck is JSIG doing here?" And he had forgotten, quite understandably, that we were preparing for the Russians to descend upon us, but he had other fish to fry at the time. He was potentially preparing for conflict, and therefore having an arms control officer who was making demands upon his staff. I was asking for resources, and we needed 2 Chinooks, we needed accommodation, we needed transport placed at various points throughout the country, because when the Russians did arrive, and we had a date for it I think it was the 15th of June, they had to be met and hosted and accommodated and facilitated properly. But this was not a priority in headquarters KFOR in the shoe factory in Macedonia. There were other much more weighty things on their mind. I was not welcome, but I remained there anyway to prepare for the Russian arrival, right up until the 12th of June, which was when KFOR eventually moved into Kosovo. And that came about as a result of a G8 forum that was held in early June, as a result of which Milosevic on the 3rd of June accepted the proposals, which included a full withdrawal of Serbian troops from Kosovo and a demilitarized Kosovo Liberation Army, or UCK as they were sometimes called, within 90 days. So he accepted that on the 3rd of June. And on the 9th of June, General Jackson and his staff and I went to have formal meetings with the Serb military commanders to draw up what was called the Military Technical Agreement, which would be the foundation and the framework under which KFOR could enter Kosovo. And the date was agreed for the 12th of June.
Now, I know you weren't directly involved in negotiations with the Serbian military, but did you hear what it was like negotiating with them?
Yes, it was very frosty. They grandstanded the whole thing. they would make speeches before we started negotiating about how the NATO air campaign had been responsible for the deaths of countless innocent civilians, how they had a legitimate claim to keep the KLA under wraps because the KLA had been responsible for the mass execution of civilians. And so the negotiations as to allowing NATO to come into what they considered to be home territory were very difficult and very frosty. And it was an insight into the negotiations that can take place between senior generals, which then continued when we were in Kosovo. I witnessed the negotiations between very senior generals on the NATO side and on the Russian side. And I was astonished at the frankness and the brutality of these negotiations. There was no tiptoeing around. There was no circumlocution of the problems. It was direct finger pointing, chest prodding arguments, full blown arguments between senior officers representing their various causes. But of course, the Serbs were not in a position to refuse. This had now been agreed by Milosevic. He'd agreed to the G8 proposals. And so they felt disarmed. And I think there was a degree of humiliation that they felt. They brought their whole entourage. It was about 20 senior Serb military commanders who sat in the room. And on the other side of the table was General Jackson, his chief of staff, his political advisor, his operations officer, his planning officer. And Muggins here was sat outside just listening. But it was just a wonderful insight into how senior officers go about their negotiations, as a result of which they signed the military technical agreement, which gave authority for NATO or KFOR rather, to move into Kosovo from 0300 on the 12th of June. And of course, as soon as that was done, then the Russian observation, which I had been there for, was clearly now off the cards. The Russians would no longer have a need to be going into Macedonia because we were no longer going to be there. So I concluded that my time with headquarters KFOR had come to an end, and I sought the permission of the Chief of Staff, General Ridgway, who coincidentally was also a Royal Tank Regiment officer. He had been my first adjutant, he'd been my squadron leader, he'd been my commanding officer. We were great friends anyway, and he happened to be the Chief of Staff of KFOR at the time. I went to him and said, well, I assume now that NATO is going into, or KFOR is going into Kosovo, that my job here is done. And he said, yep, thank you very much. You're free to go. That was on the 10th of June. So I started packing up my stuff, and I'm sure everyone else was glad to see the back of me. Our job had been done from an arms control point of view, and now it was over to the ARC, the Ace Rapid Reaction Corps, under the banner of KFOR, to implement this military technical agreement. On the 11th of June, in the evening, there was suddenly a lot of frenzied activity in the headquarters in Skopje, because they had received news of 6 IL-76 embarking troops at a Russian military airport just outside Moscow, and it was deemed that they were going to be flying into Pristina Airport. At the same time, indications were received that Bosnia-based Russian troops were preparing their vehicles, and it was estimated that if the aircraft were to take off in the next couple of hours, they could be landing at Pristina by 8 p.m. There followed the most extraordinary period of uncertainty, and it was determined then, one of the possibilities that was mentioned was that one para, who were part of 5 Airborne Brigade, should carry out a parachute assault on Pristina Airport before the Russians could get there. And a brief And we were given a briefing for an air assault. I was asked, well, I wasn't asked, I was told I'd be dropping with them. And I pointed out that I had never jumped off a train before, let alone out of an aeroplane. But that was deemed to be inconsequential to the needs, and that it's easy. You just follow the bloke in front and your chute will open and you just land. Well, if parachuting was that easy, I'm sure everyone would do it. I was more than worried at this stage at the prospect of jumping out of aircraft onto Pristina Airport on the evening of the 11th of June. The brief was given by General Jackson, and the US said they would provide the aircraft in order for this drop to take place, but it would only be UK troops dropping in. After 4 hours, the operation was called off when it was detected that the troops had got off the IL-76, and the threat to a Russian taking of the airport was deemed to have subsided. So everyone breathed a sigh of relief, and the Chief of Staff once again gave his okay for me now to disappear to the UK. This was the 11th of June. So on Saturday, the 12th of June, I had packed all my stuff, and I was driven to the airport at 3:30 in the morning to catch an early morning flight. And I had with me my rucksack, and I was in civilian clothes because I was flying on a civilian aircraft from Skopje. I was going to go to Vienna and then on to London. There was a scrum at the airport, loads of people trying to leave Macedonia. But I finally got onto the aircraft, and while we were waiting to get on, I could see the Chinooks and the Apaches all disappearing overhead. They're escorting the KFOR troops crossing the border from Macedonia into Kosovo. So the military technical agreement was underway, and KFOR was moving in, and there was no further need for this officer from JSIG, who'd been an unwelcome visitor for much of the time anyway. I got into my seat on the aircraft and I sat down. It was a Tupolev 154, so I wasn't particularly comfortable, and they have a horrendous safety record, but it was the only way I was getting out of Macedonia, so it was fine. And we were sitting there and we were delayed, and then I looked forward, and an RAF squadron leader got into the aircraft in for combat kit, and he was talking to the flight attendants, and they came up on the intercom and said, is Colonel Harrison on board? At which point I raised my hand, and they said, can you come forward? And I came forward, and the squadron leader said, you are to return to headquarters K4 now. And I said, why? And he said, because the Russians have taken the airport. So the aircraft had to be unloaded of all the baggage until they found my rucksack. It was dumped on the tarmac. There was a Lynx helicopter waiting there. And I wasn't excited at this stage. I was really, really hacked off. I had been within minutes of the doors closing and wheels rolling to go and collect my Springer Spaniel. And this was the 12th of June. It had already been over a month. And I was yanked off the aeroplane by a squadron leader, Air Ops, who said I needed to go back to headquarters K4. So I jumped on the Lynx, which was still rotors turning, and we took off. And they didn't give me any headphones. I had no idea what was going on, really. Landed at back at the shoe factory whence I had come, and was told to go and report to the Chief of Staff. And Chief of Staff, General Ridgway, briefed me and said, the Russians have taken the airport. They've driven from Bosnia. We don't know how many there are, but the orders we are receiving from SHAPE is that we are to secure a NATO presence at the airport. Right. Sorry, how does this involve me, General? He said, you are to fly forward now and meet up with the lead elements of 5 Airborne Brigade, who had led the entry into Kosovo, and they were now stationary about 10 kilometers from the airport, awaiting instructions what to do. So we then got on board another Lynx, and there were 2 Lynx flying, and we had an Apache with us. By this time, by the way, I'd got changed. I'd unpacked my rucksack. I'd got back into combats. I was offered a weapon. I chose not to carry a weapon. I was given a helmet, and I was just chucked on a lynx, and off we went. And we flew low over the border, and you could see columns and columns of K4 vehicles streaming along the roads into Kosovo. And we were flanked each side. We were joined by another Apache. We had one Apache on the left, one Apache on the right. And we flew forward and landed. And we landed at the head of the column of 5 Airborne Brigade. And the Lynx then took off, and I was then ushered towards a Land Rover where I met a man for whom I developed the utmost respect. He was Commander 5 Airborne Brigade at the time, Brigadier Adrian Freer. And he said, "Are you the Russian bloke?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I know what you mean, Brigadier. Yes, I'm here." He said, "Right." He said, "Okay, I've just been briefed by Com K4, who has received orders from General Clark that we are to secure a NATO presence on the airport, which the Russians have taken." And he said, "We're all ready to go. We're all ready to go. Whatever it takes, we are to get a NATO presence on the airport." So I said, "Well, how are you? What's your concept of operations here, Brigadier?" He said, "I don't know. We haven't got one yet. What do you recommend?" And I said, "Well, I think we should go and establish contact with the Russians first of all, and let's get talking." So they had a hastily prepared O group at the side of the road, and then we drove off, and we were the lead vehicle, and we came across a Serb military checkpoint. And I've got photos of all this. Somebody was taking photos. I received them later of Brigadier Freer and I remonstrating with the Serbs, who didn't want to allow us past their checkpoint on the road to the airport. And they went away and they consulted whomsoever they consulted, and eventually let us through. And we arrived at the outskirts of the airport, and there was a BTR 80 parked across the road with 5 soldiers stood in front, blocking the road. So we stopped about 50 yards away, and Brigadier Freer said, "Right, okay, we'll go and talk to them." So we got out and we just walked towards the Russians, who 2 of them shouldered their weapons. And Freer just said, "Keep walking, just keep walking, keep walking." I did keep walking, but I tried to shield myself a little bit behind him, I must admit at the time. It was a moment I will never forget. A British parachute regiment brigadier striding purposefully forward towards these young sentries. And he stopped, Brigadier Freer stopped, and he saluted, and he said, "Good afternoon, we are K4." And so I translated, and there was no response from the Russian sentries. I then asked to speak to an officer, and a young officer came round, and I introduced who we were, and I said, "We need to speak to your commander." And he disappeared, and we were just left there standing in the road. And Brigadier Freer said to me, "What do you think? What should we do now?" I said, "We just stay here, just wait here." And he came back and he said, the young Russian officer said, "You must follow me. We're going to meet the deputy commander of the Russian contingent, General Rybkin." So at this point, I said to Brigadier Freer, "Have you got anything that you can give as a present?" He said, "I've got a bottle of Parachute Regiment single malt." I said, That'll do. So he got out. He went back to his Land Rover, and we got out a bottle of malt whiskey, and we went forward with the young officer, and we were introduced to General Rybkin, who was very, very nervous. He was shaking. He was so nervous at the prospect of, because this was quite a momentous occasion. This was, the Russians had taken the airport, and we were the first NATO troops that he had seen, perhaps even ever met. And we introduced ourselves, and we sat down, and we just started chatting. Now, outside where we had left the rest of the contingent, the international press had started to gather, and there were TV cameras all over the place. And Brigadier Freer and I were sat in this room with General Rybkin, 2-star, and we started chatting. And we started chatting about nothing in particular. I said to Brigadier Freer that we need to establish a relationship with this man. We don't want to be starting prodding chests and threatening this, that. Let's get to know each other. And after about 10 minutes or so, Rybkin offered us refreshments, and Russian refreshments are generally clear liquids of about 40% proof, and Russian military biscuits. And we produced, or Brigadier Freer produced, a bottle of Parachute Regiment single malt whiskey. And we poured drinks, and we started drinking, and we were chatting. And it got to the point after about, I wasn't drinking because I was translating. It got to the point where they got to know each other extremely well, to the point where they exchanged T-shirts. Brigadier Freer took off his Parachute Regiment green T-shirt and gave it to Rybkin, and Rybkin took off his blue and white striped Special Forces T-shirt and gave it to Freer, who then put it on. Brigadier Freer put this Russian T-shirt on, and then he put his para smock on top. And by this time, we were, well, they were 3 sheets to the wind, and we hadn't discussed anything of note. And meanwhile, the international press was outside, clamoring for information about how this tense negotiation, this standoff, they call it, between NATO and Russia was going, when the reality was that there was 2 starred officers getting hat-racked in a disused office on the airport. So General Rybkin then invited us to have to go in a tour with him in his Jeep, a WAZ 469, around the airport so that he could show us how strong the Russian contingent was. So we agreed to this, and so the 3 of us got into this WAZ, driven by General Rybkin, who by this stage would have caused a breathalyzer to have exploded by this stage, and we drove around the airfield, which was heavily cratered as a result of the NATO bombing campaign, and there were burnt out aircraft and vehicles everywhere. And we just drove around, and he showed us that he had the perimeter secured, that he had a battalion strength of airborne forces, and he showed us the checkpoints, and we drove around. And meanwhile, the Apaches were in the sky, just hovering above us. And we got back, and then we said, right, we need to have discussions about the future of the airport. And he said, there is no discussions to be had. The airport belongs now to us. What we had noticed was that all their vehicles had painted on them KFOR. They had KFOR painted on them before they left Belgrade. And so Brigadier Freer said, well, I see you've got KFOR on your vehicles. He said, yes, we are here to help with the peacekeeping effort. He said, well, Commander KFOR is General Jackson. So do you agree you now come under command of General Jackson? And he said, no. And he said, well, you can't have it both ways. You're either KFOR or you're not. A long discussion ensued, as a result of which it was agreed as a temporary measure that 4 NATO vehicles and their crews, non-fighting vehicles, soft-skin vehicles, could stay at the airport that evening prior to any further discussions. Brigadier Freer went back and reported this, and he came back and he said that General Jackson had been told by General Clark to take the airport. Those were his orders, and General Jackson had said no. And that's well documented in General Jackson's memoirs. But Clark was absolutely adamant that we should take the airport, and he wanted to know what had happened as a result of our discussions.
So by taking the airport, he meant by force if necessary?
By force. Yes. Yeah, by force.
So actually fire on the Russians. Absolutely. To take the airport.
Absolutely. Wow. And he defied that order. We had a conversation over the radio. I say we, not me. Brigadier Freer had a conversation over the radio with General Jackson about the results of our lengthy discussions, and General Jackson agreed that as a temporary measure that the arrangement that we had come to with Rybkin could stand, and that he could legitimately claim that NATO had a foothold in the airport. So there then followed a press conference in the pouring rain, in fading light, and General Jackson flew in on his Lynx helicopter and gave a press conference. And next to him was Brigadier Freer wearing a parasmock and a Russian Special Forces t-shirt, which is just quite bizarre. But he gave this press conference to the world's press, saying that we have had fruitful and constructive negotiations with the Russians. They have agreed that their vehicles will remain on the airport, but NATO has a foothold. And that press conference, I think, can be watched on YouTube. And that was it. General Jackson disappeared off in his helicopters. The 5 Airborne Brigade, who were stood to with their weapons, were stood down. 4 Brigade were on the eastern side of the airport, 5 Brigade on the southern side, all ready to go. They were stood down, and they bypassed the airport, but left a contingent of parachute regiment vehicles, soft-skin vehicles, and the Russians positioned us at the end of the runway, and I was to stay there as to be the liaison officer between the Russians and KFOR. Now, the Russians were very nervous about our presence there. We were surrounded by armed guards. They'd obviously been told to keep an eye on us. They had BTR-80s on either side of these 4 Land Rovers that were allowed on, and they kept us under very close supervision. We weren't allowed to go anywhere or do anything, but the token presence on the airport had been established and an agreement made that further discussions would take place. Before Brigadier Freer left, we were allowed to meet the real Russian commander, General Yevtukovich, who was a 3-star, who had not come forward to begin with for protocol reasons. He had found out that the visiting British officer was a 1-star, and he was not going to demean himself by speaking to a 1-star. But eventually he did. He came out, and he was quite amenable and visibly relaxed that this had all managed to go off without anybody getting too excited. And so I was left with a bunch of hairy paras at the end of the runway that night. And that night we came under fire from the Kosovo Liberation Army, and I witnessed, it was like being at a fireworks display. I witnessed the Russian response to coming under fire. It was magnificent. Their BTRs and their soldiers with sidearms just opened up and just let it rip into the countryside. And we were just lying there and watching this little fireworks display as they came under fire. And the Kosovo Liberation Army tried to enter the airfield that night. They cut the wire, but they were intercepted by the Russians, and they were dealt with. So it wasn't a particularly peaceful first night on the airport. And as I was lying there after the day's activities, I couldn't help reflect on what a momentous occasion this was, and what would people think had they known that these tense negotiations between NATO and Russia were actually a couple of 1-star, 2-stars, having a drink, eating caviar, telling stories, and just getting on like men having a pint in the pub. And then, as an aside, discussing at the end, well, what are we going to do about this airport? Well, how about we have... First of all, Brigadier Freer said he wanted half the airport. And he said, no, that is not going to happen. The airport is Russian. And the compromise was to allow us to have a token presence, but then to conduct further negotiations thereafter. And in the meantime, the airport would be bypassed by KFOR troops and isolated. And that was a key factor, that that KFOR sealed the airport off. They surrounded the perimeter, and there was nowhere for the Russians to go, even if they had wanted to.
How were the Russians resupplied?
Well, I'm going to come on to that, Ian, because the resupply became a really thorny issues as the days progressed. But now that you've mentioned it, I'll skip forward a few days. So I was operating as the liaison officer between the Russians and General Jackson, and General Jackson had set up a temporary headquarters in, I think it was Kosovo, about 20 kilometers away from the airport. And he summoned the Russian commander to him the next day, the 3-star. The only transport that the Russians had with them was a single jeep, which was now broken, and their BTRs. So General Kovic said to me that if he was being summoned to see General Jackson, he was going to travel in a BTR-80. Now, I determined at this point that the arrival of a Russian BTR-80 at the front gate of the operational headquarters of KFOR might cause somewhat of a stir. So I offered to go with him, and we both mounted a BTR-80 and we drove from the airport to a pre-arranged meeting at KFOR. And when we arrived there, the look on the sentries' faces, the British sentries' faces, as a Russian armoured personnel carrier rocked up, and on top of it was sat a British lieutenant colonel with a Union Jack on his badge who saluted the guard commander, and it was as if something didn't compute in their minds. Hang on, this is a Russian armoured vehicle, but there's a British lieutenant colonel commanding it on top. Anyway, we went in to see General Jackson, and then the real negotiations started. And this was what I was mentioning earlier about being witness to how senior generals do operate. And General Jackson said that, well, in fact, I've got 2 reporters' notebooks full of notes from all the meetings that we had over the next 6 weeks or so. But I can assure you that I think diplomats would have called it a frank exchange of views was had on the future of the Russian contingent, the legitimacy of the Russians at the airport, the future of the Russians at the airport, and that NATO was now closing the airspace, and that there would be no resupply for the Russians. And he used that as a bargaining chip with the General Yevtukovich to ensure that there could be a substantial NATO presence at the airport. The Russians wanted, as their opening gambit, they said they would want to be a lead nation in KFOR, that they wanted to have sole control of the airport and their own AOR, Area of Operational Responsibility, which was to include Pristina. So that was their opening gambit. And General Jackson, who was speaking with the authority of Sakur, who said, none of that is going to happen. None of that is going to happen. And General Yevtukovich was absolutely livid at this and threatened the use of force to do it. And General Jackson was very circumspect, very calm about this. And he said, don't you dare threaten me. Don't you dare threaten me. And that was the sort of language they were using at these negotiations. But you mentioned the resupply, because at the end of this conversation, the Russian generals said that they needed resupply of fuel, and they also needed water, and they would need food. Now, it was 12th, 13th of June. It was incredibly hot. It really was hot. I don't know what the temperature was, but it was burning hot, and people were drinking a lot of water. And the Russians had only been able to bring with them what they could carry. And so shortly after having threatened the use of force, the Russian general had to say, listen, we need water, we need food, and the airspace is closed. They cannot resupply from the air. And General Jackson said, we'll think about it. The Russians returned. We had a long discussion about how we were going to manage this, and it was agreed that we would drip feed, literally, forgive the pun, drip feed the Russians water in exchange for concessions about the occupation of the airport. So the initial load was a single lorry load full of 2-litre bottles of water. I think we delivered about 300 bottles of water, which was only going to be enough for a day or two at the very most for the Russians. And then General Yevtukovich would be summoned once again to headquarters KFOR, where they would have these other discussions, each side having sought advice and guidance from their respective headquarters. Incidentally, where I was sleeping I had a little tent at the runway. It was very near the satellite vehicle the Russians were using to communicate with Moscow. And Kovic had this wonderful habit of, he used to shout. He thought the louder you shouted into a microphone, the more likely you were to be heard in Moscow. Anyway, the result was I heard all his conversations, his side of the conversation anyway, with Moscow. He was complaining about how they were being treated and what should he do and should he take action, and they were surrounded, and what would be the next negotiating point from the Russian point of view. And as I say, I have minutes of all these meetings here, which I kept in these reporters' notebooks about the ongoing negotiations between Generals Jackson and Kovic. So we kept.
Is there some of that notebook that you can read just to give us a bit of a flavour of what you were noting down there?
Yeah, I'll go to the first meeting. Right, first meeting between General Jackson and General Yevtukovich. Cousin was the 3-star who subsequently came to lead the Russian contingent. Was that Russia would assume lead nation status, but they were willing to cooperate with KFOR. They wanted KFOR to address their legitimate security concerns about the actions and the activity of the Kosovo Liberation Army. They wished to expand the airport into an AOR comprising 400 square kilometers around Pristina. They wished to occupy the tunnels at the back end of the airport where aircraft had been stored. They would allow the UN World Food Programme to come in with helicopters into the airport. NATO was to lift the air embargo over not only Kosovo, but also over Romania and Hungary. They would maintain liaison between NATO and the Serbian armed forces. They wanted a logistic resupply of ammunition, water, and food. There would be no further meetings with NATO until such time as NATO agreed to these demands. The response from General Jackson was the airport would remain in NATO hands under NATO control through a NATO air embargo. There was to be no contact between the Russians and the Serbs. No AOR would be granted. No logistic resupply would take place. And that's what I got written down for the first meeting.
Did you note down the Russian reaction to that?
I've put down here, livid, finger pointing and livid. How dare he deprive the Russian contingent of the necessary means to continue to exist. We are part of the same force, he said. We are all part of KFOR here. We're here for a common aim, and yet you are going to starve us and deprive us of water. The concept of operations in Kosovo has been agreed to in Moscow. We are here to cooperate. Then their reports came in that the Soviet vehicles had been moving off the airport and into the local towns. General Jackson said that if that continued to happen, that he would not be answerable for the consequences of unidentified armoured vehicles moving in an uncoordinated fashion throughout the AOR, area of operational responsibility. So it was quite tense, the meetings. They were very forthright, but you could tell that there was a mutual respect and understanding, and that they were really representing their nation's views. But as individuals, you could tell that there was the odd smile, and refreshments were offered and were always brought along by the Russians. So at a human level, they were getting on, but they were representing each other's nation's views robustly. And I was just fortunate enough to be a facilitator there. What was discussed very early on was how the resupply and reinforcement of both the Russian contingent and the KFOR troops was going to take place. And the Russians were insistent that they wished to bring in a brigade's worth of troops in order to establish their own area of operational responsibility. It was agreed eventually that the Russians could have an area of operational responsibility, but nowhere near where they wanted it. In fact, they took a bit of the German sector and I think a bit of the Italian sector. The thorny issue then arose as to how the Russians were going to bring in their reinforcements and their logistic resupply. And clearly this had to be done by air, but NATO had closed the airspace. So there then was about 5 days of discussions about how the NATO air blockade could be lifted in order to facilitate both a Russian and a KFOR resupply route into Pristina Airport. While this was going on, because I had got to know many of the Russian senior commanders, I was allowed to wander around the Pristina Airport with the Russian, what they'd call now their Russian military base. I was given a Russian ID card, so I wasn't challenged by any of the sentries. And I went into the airport buildings. I've still got a sign here. Actually, it hangs up in my paddocks, which is the blown off sign of the last civilian flight to leave Pristina Airport, which was going to Cologne. I've still got the flight number board there, but the whole of the building was completely smashed. It had been bombed significantly by NATO. The runway was cratered, but most interesting for me was there was a tunnel complex which NATO had known about and had tried to bomb the entrance to and the exit from. But they had failed, and the Serbs had managed to remove their aircraft the day before NATO entered Kosovo. But I managed to get into the tunnel complex, and I'm afraid old habits die hard, Ian. And when I was in the tunnel complex, I went to search all the offices, and I came back with all sorts of photos of Serb commanders, Serb operational orders for the defense of the airfield, how to operate their anti-aircraft weapon systems. And I took photos of the maps. All sorts. Anyway, by this stage, of course, the Serbs had left the airport, but I managed to get all their documentation, which they had left in their offices, in their cabinets, before the Russians decided that they would seal the tunnels off and place armed guards there. But I was allowed to wander around.
I was just going to say, at least you didn't have to dig through a rubbish dump for them. They were just lying around.
Yeah, but it's interesting, Ian, around the airport, they had dummy aircraft which had been bombed by NATO. They had placed a lot of these aircraft around the airport, and we came across quite a few of these model but life-size armored vehicles and tanks made out of rubber, made out of wood, and they'd been placed at various points, and they'd all been attacked and they were smashed to pieces. But the Serbs had put stuff out for NATO aircraft to see and to attack. It was great deception. I was amazed. And one of the aircraft they put out was a MiG-21, which they had been using up until that point as a gate guardian. They put it out on a taxiway, and it had been shot, and I got inside it and managed to get the altimeter off, and that now resides in the tank museum at Bovington, along with lots of other bits and pieces that I liberated from Russian aircraft and Russian vehicles. Anyway, I digress.
No, but you're right. Old habits die very hard. I can tell if you.
Well, I mean, it was left there.
Yeah,
and there was no lighting in these tunnels, but it was a huge complex, and these tunnels were capable of holding, I don't know, 10, 15 aircraft, and they had all the bays in which the aircraft were parked, the munitions there. So I recovered quite a few of the munitions. I mean, I don't think this is of any intelligence value to anybody, but it just seemed to be too good an opportunity to miss. So I relieved the Serbs of a handful of their operational documents, and they were processed, and indeed they were found to be of little intelligence value, but there we are.
You talked about you could walk around the Russian camp. Did you talk to some of the other Russian soldiers there? Like the other ranks or anything like that, or not, while you were wandering
Other
around?
ranks weren't allowed.
Because that was one of your skills, wasn't it, in BRIXMIS, was getting that engagement and understanding their morale, I guess.
Yes, so I certainly engaged all the Russians with conversation, and indeed I would be lying if I said I didn't socialize and fraternize with the Russians to a certain extent in the evenings. We got to know each other extremely well. I was left alone there. I was dependent upon the Russians for my own force protection, and so it made sense to me to not to alienate myself from the Russians, but to befriend them and to gain their trust. And I thought that a good way of doing this was to go and join them and eat with them. So I didn't have any rations myself. I had all I had was a tent, and I had a slab of water which had been left for me. But I was for my life support, I was dependent upon the Russians. So I used to go and eat with the Russians in a bombed out HAZ, hardened aircraft shelter. And I used to eat the Russian military food and sit down with the soldiers and just chat. And to begin with, understandably, they were very reluctant to engage with me. I started wearing a Russian forage cap and a blue and white striped T-shirt, which I had been given. And when I was in with the socializing with the Russians, I took my rank slides off and I just chatted with them and drank with them. I have to say that those 2.5 months, I consumed more vodka than I think I've consumed ever in my life. It was extraordinary how the Russian priorities in terms of their life support measures, how their priorities differ from ours. They didn't have any water, but there was no shortage of vodka. And so I used to sit down with them every evening and drink and eat and just chat. I would generally steer away from any issue which was going to upset them. What I wanted to do was to gain their trust, so that when I came back to them with a message from COMK4, they knew that I would not only deliver the message, but I would also deliver to them what I thought the message really meant, and how I thought they should respond. They had a political officer with them, Dima. I didn't like him. He was clearly old school intelligence, and he was very suspicious of me. And it took a long time before we became friends. But by the end of 2 months, we did get on very well. But he was always very wary, and he would follow me around and he would listen into my conversations. And where I could, I would engage soldiers. They didn't really have much to offer because they didn't even know where they were, let alone why they were there. But I would speak to the officers, but in particular their operations officers, who were all senior to me in rank. I was a lieutenant colonel at the time, and they were all full colonels, and they had a whole clutch of 1-stars. And I would chat to them, and they weren't interested in chatting about the political military situation. They wanted to know about NATO equipment. They wanted to know about NATO pay scales, housing, schooling for children, just normal run-of-the-mill stuff which soldiers from different armies would chat about, and I would engage with them. And yes, I would go back, and then I would report back to Generals Ridgway and Jackson where I thought the Russian frailties were, where I thought they could be exploited, what their weaknesses were. It was an interesting experience for me, because I felt an affinity with the Russians, and I felt obviously a much greater affinity with KFOR. But I wanted to assist the Russians, and I wanted to assist KFOR. It was just a matter of greasing the wheels and knowing what motivated Russians, and I was fortunate enough to be in a position at that time to do it. But had it not been for this squadron leader and the RAF getting on board this Tupolev 154 at Skopje Airport, there would have been no Russian liaison officer there at all. By the time I left, Ian, they had brought in 4 more Russian specialists from the UK, who then took over the duties of liaising between the Russians and COMK4. But by that stage, things had stabilized somewhat, even though there were daily complaints raised by both sides about the behavior and attitude of the others, whilst the political machinations were turning. The only other significant event that took place was the eventual agreement that Pristina Airport should be open again for both the Russian resupply and for K4 resupply. And a huge discussion took place about which aircraft should arrive first. And the Russians wanted their aircraft, 3 IL-76. They wanted them to arrive first, and we wanted our aircraft to arrive first. And eventually there was this plan concocted whereby both aircraft would land simultaneously so that no side could claim that they had been the first to reoccupy the airport with aircraft. And so on the 26th of June, there was a big hoo-ha. Lots of press were there. General Jackson arrived in his Lynx helicopters and got on top of the air traffic control building along with the Russian general, who by now was General Zavazin. And they both had radios to their respective aircraft. And they went through the process of speaking to the pilots to the aircraft to give them permission to land. It was all gesture stuff. And then both aircraft landed, and both the generals, Jackson and Zavazin, went out onto the tarmac. And General Jackson met the Russian aircraft commanders and the Russian contingent commanders. And General Zavazin went and met the British Hercules pilots and the crews on board. And there then took place an impromptu press conference at the edge of the airport. And I hadn't prepared for this. Normally when there was going to be a press conference which I had to translate, I would be given a prior sight of what was going to be said so that I could prepare myself linguistically, I mean. But on this occasion, I had no preparation whatsoever. General Zavazin walked over to the assembled press ranks, and they had put up a little microphone for him, and everybody was there. There was Sky News there, BBC News, and I was required to translate. And he started chatting away about how it was good to see NATO and Russia combining and cooperating and working together in close harmony for a common good, and all that was fine. And then he used a word, and I had never come across this word before. I'll never forget it. The word is nasilia, which means violence, and it was quite crucial that I got the word right, because he was talking about threats of violence, and I guessed it, which you should never do as an interpreter. You should have the courage to say, I'm sorry, can you say that? Can you explain that word somehow differently? But I bottled it in front of the press, and I guessed it, and I guessed the word violence, and I guessed it right. And then the press conference ended without any incident. But I must admit, from a linguistic point of view, it was one of those really scary moments where what you're saying, what you're translating, is clearly of importance and is going out live to the world. And if you get it wrong, you can send the wrong message to a whole load of people. But I didn't have the courage to stop him mid-flow and say, sorry, I don't understand that. Can you explain that? I just guessed it. And someone was looking down on me that day, and I managed to guess the right word. I will never forget that Russian word as long as I will live. Nasilia means violence.
It must be really difficult doing those translations, because I guess with Russian, some of the word order is a bit different as well, and you're trying to get it into a shape where context is everything, and how you're translating, because different words can just come across different ways, or words in a different order can come across in a different way and be read very differently by whoever's receiving it.
Yeah, very much so. And one of the major difficulties is that very few people know how to use an interpreter. So if I'm interpreting for you, what matters is what comes out of my mouth, not what you say. It's what I say. And therefore, if you try and introduce nuance or hyperbole, or somehow try and mask what you're saying and convey a different message, that doesn't translate to me. I just translate your words. And quite often as an interpreter, what you have to do is to listen to people, try and figure out what it is, the sense of what they're trying to convey, and then put that into your own words. And somebody who knows how to use an interpreter will speak, first of all, in using very plain language in short bursts. What tends to happen is that they will go off on one and they'll speak for a couple of minutes and then look at you. And it's your job then to try and encapsulate what they have just been ranting on and put it in another language. When you're dealing with senior officers like this, you can't step in and say, listen, use simple words, speak slowly, short sentences, and we'll get on fine. You can't do that. They just go off on one and they'll speak for a couple of minutes and then they'll stop and look at you. And you have to try and put that into the other language. And quite often, and more, in fact, almost certainly, you will lose some of the innuendos and the nuances that were intended. I remember once in Moscow when I was required to interpret for our chief of defense staff, who was meeting his opposite number, and his opposite number, the Russian, thought it would be a good idea to tell a joke. Well, jokes generally don't translate. And he told this joke, and I lost the sense of it halfway through it, but I know it was about a frog, and this frog was dead in the middle of the pond. And anyway, he told the whole joke, and his side of the room, the Russians, all burst out laughing. And then it was over to me. So I just said to the chief of defense staff, I said, he's just told a joke. I have no idea what the joke is, but I do know it involved a frog and it was dead in the middle of the pond, and now would be a really good opportunity to laugh. And so they all laughed, and that was it. But jokes and innuendo, nuance, don't translate generally. Yeah. But on that day, I had to guess at it.
And what was it like working with Mike Jackson?
Well, to begin with, I was, as I say, a bad smell, and he wouldn't acknowledge me at all when we were in Macedonia. But once we were in Kosovo, he would call me, and he would ask my advice. He would ring me up. I had a single channel radio access terminal, SCRAT, which was given to me, a secure link back to headquarters K4. And quite often he would just ring and talk to me. More often than not, it was General Ridgway, his chief of staff. But before every meeting with the Russians, General Jackson would call me in and say, right, okay, what's happening? What's going on down there? What do you think we should do? And so I found myself in the position of being an advisor, but my advice was always tempered by the political advisor who would accompany General Jackson everywhere. He was a civilian. And so I would offer military advice based on my knowledge of the Russians and their intentions. And then the political advisor would offer his political advice. And then General Jackson would make a decision. But the only reason he asked me for advice was because I was the only one who could deal with the Russians. I happened to be somebody who had a lot of experience working with the Russian military and knew how they ticked. I knew on that day, on the 12th of June, I knew that if we went into that very first meeting with General Rybkin, if we went in there with an aggressive stance and threatening to take the airport, and I just knew that they would push back, and that the way to deal with Russians is to gain their trust as human beings, and not to posture, but to sit down and drink a glass of vodka, and drink a glass of whiskey, talk man to man, and come to a sensible arrangement. But once
and swap t-shirts,
swap t-shirts. That was, I think General Brigadier Freer got into some trouble about that later on, because the world's press was filming press conference, and there was a half-cut brigadier wearing a Russian Special Forces t-shirt in the background. But that was how K4 encountered the Russians on that day, and it was tense because the message from Brussels was take the airport.
What do you know? What the Russians' orders were? To hold it at all costs.
The Russian orders were to take the airport, to not allow a NATO presence on the airport, and to meet any attempt to occupy the airport with force. And so, weapons were made ready on both sides on that day, and it was tense. It really was tense, and it took a lot of I mean, when Sakur orders the airport to be taken, it takes a lot of courage from General Jackson to say, no, we're not going to do that. We're negotiating right now. Because this happened whilst we were in the middle of what we called negotiation.
Yeah, just the whole concept of NATO forces firing on Russian forces just seems a crazy situation to be in. And I just can't understand how Wesley Clark, I know he's miles away and isn't on the ground, why he thought that was going to be a good move.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, Ian. That was well above my pay grade. I do know that it was his idea that we should airdrop one para onto Pristina Airport on the night of the 11th of June. And I do know it was his idea that we should take the airport by force. As to what his motivations are, I don't know. Has he written a autobiography? I don't know. I know General Jackson has, and he deals with it in a very sympathetic way, and really is undervalues his own moral courage in not standing up to it. We had no idea that this was happening, of course. These negotiations with General Clark were taking place whilst we were inside a little office drinking vodka. And those were his orders to take the airport.
And so where was James Blunt in all of this?
Yes, well, I'd like to know. I've heard his tales about driving into Kosovo with a guitar strapped to the back of his CVRT, his scimitar. Certainly the forward elements were around the airport, preventing Russians from leaving the airport. We blockaded the airport, as I think I mentioned earlier. We surrounded the airport. But in terms of him having dealings with the Russians, I can categorically 100% say that did not happen on that day. It did not. He may well have come across Russians later on. I don't know. Unlikely, because they were confined to the limits of the airport, and it was a stipulation that no British fighting vehicles would occupy the airport. So the only vehicles that we had on the airport were Land Rovers, with a signals detachment there providing communications back to K4. But where James Blunt was, I have no idea. I've listened to his stories, and I actually wrote to him once after I heard one of his stories on TV to question his account of what happened, because I was in the very fortunate position of knowing 100% that is not what transpired. But there we go. I mean, there were weeks of negotiations thereafter, Ian, and I don't know what I'm going to do with the minutes of all these meetings, but I do know that there came a point when the Chief of Staff said to me that my work is done, that they were bringing in other people now from UK, and that I was free to return to UK. Before we did so, he and I flew to Brussels. We had a meeting with D. Sakur about what had happened. We then went to Rheindalen, and that was wonderful, flying around on an HS-125 and having our own Lynx and Chinook helicopters on call. But eventually I was allowed to go back to UK. I managed to get myself back down to Skopje and hitched a lift on a Hercules that came into Bryce Norton. And then I was picked up by my unit, by JSIG, and taken back. And then I knocked on the door of my neighbour and said, and this was on the 29th of July, and said, I've come to collect my dog. I don't think my dog recognised me by this stage, but they'd been looking after.
And had you managed to be in contact with your neighbour in the meantime to say...
Yes, I did.
Or was he just thinking he's never coming back? That's it.
No, that was another amusing part. If we go back a few months, for the purpose of the Russian inspection under Vienna Document 99, JSIG, my host unit, had given me a mobile phone so that I could maintain contact with them during the inspection, letting them know what's going on. Well, I still had that mobile phone with me, and when I went into Kosovo, and I used it all the time. I used it not only for work purposes, so I was ringing MO4, Military Operations Department 4 in the MOD with regular updates, Directorate of Military Operations in the MOD. I was also ringing JSIG, but I also thought, sod it, I'm out here in the middle of nowhere, and all I had was one change of underwear and 2 sets of combat kit. The stuff that I'd brought out for 4 days initially. Yeah. I had nothing with me, and I'm sleeping on concrete at the end of runway 29 near a bombed out air shelter, and I'm going to ring my family. And I did. And I rang them regularly. And I got back to JSIG, and about 3 weeks later, the finance chap, who was a civilian, he was the chap who paid for all our flights. He came storming into my office with a mobile phone bill. It was in excess of £2,000. £2,000 of mobile phone. He said,
wow.
And I said, you expect me to pay that? You can swivel. Because anyway, it was written off. But I mean, little things like, I was out there when the school summer holidays started. My children were at school, a boarding school in Ascot, and I wasn't there for them. So I had to arrange for somebody to go to my house using one of the spare keys, which the housing department had, go into my house, go into my safe, fetch their passports, and have them couriered on a motorbike to their school, and then for them to be taken to Heathrow so they could fly out and join their mother. All sorts of little things like that, which I did by using my mobile phone.
And all whilst you're having to deal with the Russians and General Jackson.
Yeah, but what a privilege. What a privilege it was to be in the presence of those very capable people who were representing the interests of their nations in a very forthright and robust manner. But fortunately, the human element triumphed, and they were able to see eye to eye. They would never be best of friends, but they had a lot of mutual respect. And I was just a fly on the wall. I had no executive authority or input or influence of any description. I was just there to grease the wheels and make sure that people understood each other in a way which perhaps someone without any Russian experience might not have been able to convey. And that's all I brought to the party, is an understanding of the Russian military psyche, of the Russian military mind, and on the other hand, being a member of KFOR, of J, and representing General Jackson's and NATO's interests to the Russians. And that is the sum total of what I did. I was a facilitator and nothing more.
Yeah, but I think if you hadn't have been there, then there might have been some missteps in the negotiations as far as misunderstandings and stuff like that. I think, as you said, your experience in dealing with the Soviet military through the Cold War, your time in Moscow, you had quite a unique insight, and you were dragged off the right plane at the right time to be in the right place to make things run smoothly, to facilitate, like you said.
General Jackson was kind enough to write to me afterwards, and he said, but for your presence, things could have been quite different. That's enough, more than enough for me. And I regard it as one of the highlights of my time in uniform. BRIXMIS, Kosovo, both before we went into Kosovo and in Macedonia. And the other highlights were Moscow and what I got up to there. So I was, my dog didn't recognize me, but my daughters did. So win-win.
That's good. Well, Stephen, that's an incredible story. I'm looking forward to listening back to that. Stephen also features in 2 earlier episodes 250 and 251, where he talks about his exploits with BRIXMIS in East Germany during the Cold War. There'll be links to those episodes in the episode information. The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.